Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. We're going to be talking about a variety of different things. Hope you had a good weekend, and I suspect more and more of you had a chance to watch various programs on television, on Zoom, or a variety of other formats, because indeed we are seeing more and more individuals who have maybe never made their way into a church, nevertheless watch these church services. And a little while ago, I taped an interview that we did with and will play in the future with Pastor Jack Graham, and he is the pastor of Prestonwood Baptist Church. And we were told yesterday that the president, Donald Trump, watched it the other day when, of course, he watched Greg Laurie. Just lots of people tuned in to see what the president was going to watch. And I suspect once we get the numbers for Prestonwood, it will be the same thing. And by the way, that interview I did with Jack Graham not only talks about what happened over the weekend, in which he had a chance to interview the governor, Greg Abbott, but also, of course, the president of the United States was watching the program. But then we spent some time talking about this idea of the church and mental health. And our original plan was at the 2 o'clock hour today, we were going to have Michael Perrin with us to talk about that. He's running a fever and is sick, so we will try to get to him in the future. And we'll play the interview with Pastor Graham, and then also, of course, the live interview, we hope, with Michael Perrin. So that's what is coming down a couple of hours from now. Let me just, as a program note, mention that we're going to have Lydia McGrew with us. She's been with us before, as we've talked about, hidden in plain view, various undesigned coincidences in the Gospels and the book of Acts, which are just a very compelling and powerful argument for everything from the historical accuracy of these, as well as the interesting way in which sometimes we have an answer to one question that might surface in one of the Gospels answered in another. We're going to talk about the mirror and the mask, liberating the Gospels from literary devices, and that all will take place an hour from now. But let's, if we can, talk about a number of things. First of all, of course, the president gave us the guidelines. Then, of course, the governor has a set of guidelines. So I wanted to summarize those real briefly. Then I'll get into maybe some good news in the midst of all of this. And then we're going to talk about how, because of the decision to only limit hospitals to COVID-19 and to eliminate what are oftentimes considered non-essential surgeries, a number of hospitals are heading towards bankruptcy, so we need to change that policy very quickly. A good example of something I'll talk about later today as well, in which we have unintended consequences. One of the examples I'll use later has to do with the fact that there was a desire in the part of the CARES Act to actually provide individuals who were unemployed with benefits that exceed what they would have made if they're working. That has, of course, if you think about it for a minute, the unintended consequence of not wanting to go back to work. If I'm going to make more by sitting at home than I will going to work, you can see the problem with that. And so there was an attempt by senators like Ben Sasse and others to change that. Didn't get anywhere. So that's one of another of these examples of unintended consequences. And those tend to happen when policies are rushed into or people haven't thought about the consequences of some of those. Then I want to talk a little bit about people rewriting history, because Representative Dan Crenshaw has put out a series of Twitter posts, and I will read those. But also, if you go out, you will see that he has also now put out some video which, interesting enough, President Donald Trump reprinted as well and reposted on his Twitter account, so a lot more people will see it, about how, again, there's just this attempt to rewrite history and to say some things that really aren't accurate. And before we're all done, while we're talking about how the media and some politicians are not doing a very good job, Bill Maher says some things I think almost all of us around the table would agree with. And, of course, he says it in a way that I'm going to have to edit out the naughty words. But nevertheless, actually sending a warning to some of the people in the media, keep up this dishonest virus reporting, and Donald Trump will win in 2020 in a landslide. So, and I think he's right on that point. And, Bill Maher or anybody else is right. He's right. And so we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Just to take a break, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but in case you've not seen the actual guidelines that were posted by the Coronavirus Task Force, let me summarize them very quickly. If you'd like to read them for yourself, if you'd like to print them out and show them to others, if you'd like to post them on your Facebook page, we posted those on Friday, so they should be easy to follow. Phase 1 is really dependent on, again, what kind of testing we have in the past. But then again, all vulnerable individuals should self-quarantine. When in public, individuals should continue social distancing and avoid gathering. Non-essential travel should still be avoided, and schools and youth camps will remain closed, which is just a devastation right now for some of these Christian camps. And restaurants, gyms, and movie theaters can reopen under very strict social distancing and cleaning procedures. So that's a possibility. And, of course, those of you in the Dallas area listening right now, I've got my mask. Even to get into this building, I had to wear this mask. Even just going to the restroom, I have to wear this mask. I don't have any problem with that, but, that's what's going on right now, even in the city of Dallas. Phase 2, then, all vulnerable individuals still self-quarantine. When in public, still the idea of physical distancing, but now maybe the limit is not 10 people, but 50 people. Non-essential travel is permitted. Schools and youth camps can reopen, and I'm not thinking any of that happens till the fall, but we'll see. Business is still encouraged to do teleworking and try to close down common areas and those kinds of things. Restaurants, gyms, movie theaters, a number of others operate under less strict social distancing. And by the time we get to phase 3, the idea is still vulnerable individuals might be able to resume normal activities, but still should avoid crowds. Trips to nursing homes can resume. Businesses and work sites and sites can maybe be under normal operations. And bars, gyms, movie theaters, restaurants can resume normal operations with limited social distancing, which I think is just a way of saying that it may just never be like it is right now. And it may never be like it was in the past. But it'll be some variation of that. We won't necessarily only allow people to order through a window of a restaurant, but the days of really crowded restaurants may be over. And a good illustration of that, if you haven't seen this latest graph, I will see if we can post it up there as well. But again, it is a graph where you have the top 25 metro areas, and you see one line just shooting up exponentially, and that's New York. And then the other 24, they just sort of hug the it'd be the x-axis there. And so you see that really, when you get right down to it, the one place which is completely the outlier, completely different than the rest of metro areas in other parts of the country, is New York City. They can come up with all sorts of reasons. It's a much more metropolitan city. There are many more people. Of course, the subways are still open, and so people are packed into the subways even while they're supposed to be social distancing. And you can go on and on and on. And even the differences sometimes between the different areas of New York City are different, as we've talked about here before. But it is striking to see that really the hot spot has and always looks like it will continue to be New York City. Some of the other cities certainly have had loss of life. No one's diminishing that, but it is very different than what we've seen in New York City. Let's take a break, though. We'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Scott Gottlieb, former FDA administrator, concluded that this coronavirus would probably have been more deadly than the Spanish flu if it appeared in 1918. That's a reasonable conclusion based on what we know about this virus and what was not medically available back then. We currently have a debate about the severity and extent of COVID-19. Some skeptics believe the dangers have been exaggerated. Some of the models predicted more infections and more deaths than have occurred. Healthcare professionals lament that many Americans don't seem to take the warning seriously. These debates will go on for months. One thing we probably can all accept is that this virus would have taxed the medical capabilities of 1918. The world was at war, and medical facilities were nothing like what we have today. For example, a patient with COVID-19 today who needs intensive care still has a good chance of survival. We're seeing patients being rolled out of hospitals after facing significant respiratory issues. Gottlieb observes that anyone who gets admitted to a prolonged ICU stay with COVID-19 who ends up getting intubated or ends up getting a prolonged care, that's probably someone who would have died from the Spanish flu. He therefore concluded that COVID-19 not only looks like the Spanish flu in terms of its distribution across the age range, but also looks far more fearsome. At the very least, his observation should make you feel grateful that you not only live in the 21st century, but that you live in the U.S. It has been popular among many politicians to criticize America's healthcare system and to attack Big Pharma. Yet these observations from the former FDA commissioner is a reminder of the benefits we enjoy in this country at this time. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Obviously talking about the coronavirus, and I love Jim Garrett. He had one came out on Friday, so there's a widespread rumor that this is Friday, and it was. But in the Friday issue, I wanted to talk about that, but we had so much to talk about with Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford, and never got to it. And one of the things that I thought might be positive is to talk about there seem to be some effective treatments for COVID-19. And one of those is an already researched drug. Some of these are going through clinical trials, so it's going to take a long time, but some are already available, and one of those is remdesivir. And it turns out that this is from an infectious disease specialist at the University of Chicago. She said, the best news is that most of our patients have already been discharged, which is great. We've only had 2 patients perish. And so she has been overseeing the studies of remdesivir, and so that is one that is being used. I'll talk about chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine in just a minute, but before I get to another drug, this is really interesting, and that is the unbelievable surprise that sometimes one of the best ways to treat somebody who has COVID-19 and is having respiratory stress is to have them lie on their stomachs. I'm not making this up. This is interesting. This comes from Massachusetts General Hospital. Okay, Mass General, pretty good hospital, great research hospital. Catherine Hibbert, who's the director of medical ICU. Here's what they said. Quote, doctors are finding that placing the sickest coronavirus patients on their stomachs, called prone positioning, helps increase the amount of oxygen that's getting to their lungs. One of the researchers there actually said we're saving lives with this 100%. Whoa. Okay, one of the other directors there at Northwell Health, and this is a director that actually is owning, I think, 23 different hospitals in New York, said it's such a simple thing to do, and we've seen remarkable improvement. We can see it for every single patient. And then, of course, I was quoting from Catherine Hibbert. Once you see it work, you want to do it more. You see it work almost immediately. So in some respects, there may be some treatments that don't necessarily require drugs, although obviously they're giving certain kinds of treatments there as well. And that is the case. Now, of course, I've postponed discussing what has become kind of a partisan political football, and that's because at one point, President Donald Trump, and let's also mention some talk show hosts, and that would be like, Sean Hannity, have talked about the potential benefit of chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, which is actually used to treat malaria and also has been something that people that have lupus actually have been taking for many years. Now, the reason that surfaced initially is that some of these really smart doctors in China noticed that none of their lupus patients had the coronavirus. And so that got them thinking about what it was. And then they even found that some that weren't at that point in time taking hydroxychloroquine, nevertheless still were there. So it wasn't like they were just taking that the day before. They had it in their system for some time. So, of course, because Donald Trump mentioned it, and because he's not a doctor, and because a lot of people accused him of prescribing something medically, there's been a lot of criticism. And frankly, some of that might be justified if for no other reason than even as this was being talked about, there were people that are saying, wait a minute, there are individuals that if they have been taking this, sometimes have heart arrhythmias or heart issues. Interestingly enough, when that discussion was taking place weeks ago, I had somebody who's one of my Facebook friends who had taken hydroxychloroquine because he had malaria when he was in Africa, talk about the fact that he had heart damage. So, of course, that is the case. But then the one that has really caused people to take note is, and it's always interesting, when a celebrity gets a disease and a celebrity says something, it almost has more weight than when a doctor does. And as you may remember, Tom Hanks and his wife, Rita Wilson, actually contracted COVID-19 in Australia. And so she has now come out talking about some of the negative side effects of hydroxychloroquine. Now, let's be honest. She talks about that when she first came down with the disease, she was so weak she could hardly stand. So then when she took it, it did clear up some of the symptoms, but then she had, raging nausea and a number of other side effects. Not pleasant, but I'm not sure, how I'm, if I think I'm on death's door or I'm so weak, I'm willing to try just about anything. But nevertheless, this has become another one of those footballs. And the reality is very simple. We're going to, because of this divided country, because of all the tribalism, anytime anybody says something, if they're not part of our tribe, somebody's going to criticize them. So, of course, the criticism that has been leveled at the president and the talk show host and everything else. And, of course, you even had other talk show host, Michael Savage, who, by the way, has a PhD in epidemiology. Maybe you know something about this, has criticized some of the other people for speaking out. So it's just one of the ways that this game gets played every single day. But let's move on to some other issues, because if you look at your local hospitals, you would be thinking, well, they must be doing pretty well because they are keeping all sorts of staff hired. They're dealing with COVID-19. Of course, these primary care workers sometimes are coming down with the disease, so that's kind of pathetic and sad and devastating and all the rest that you can come up with. But one of the things, if you started looking at their balance sheet, is many of these hospitals are headed towards bankruptcy. And I want to read this from our friends at the Wall Street Journal. Public health officials have directed Americans to stay home to slow the coronavirus spread and ease the burden on healthcare providers. Many of the areas of the country are succeeding. So much so that hospitals and physicians are hemorrhaging cash due to declining demand for care. Matter of fact, some of them are sending home some of the doctors and nurses. Not good. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention last month recommended that healthcare providers postpone elective procedures to free up capacity and conserve protective equipment for treating coronavirus patients. Governors have likewise ordered providers and citizens to reschedule non-essential appointments. For better or worse, these directions are being stringently observed, our editors at the Wall Street Journal point out. And hip and knee replacements are being delayed. So are mastectomies. Some doctors are pausing chemotherapy treatments for less aggressive cancers due to government recommendations. Although one today, our engineer is going through chemotherapy today. And that's why we're so glad Doug's here covering for that. But nevertheless, you can see this, and some are also avoiding that to avoid suppressing patient immune systems. So I understand all of this as well. Preventive screenings, including mammograms, colonoscopies, melanoma checks have been canceled. And you kind of see what's happening here. The lockdowns are doing great in, if you will, flattening the curve, but they're doing unintended harm to medical providers. And so this is where really very quickly we've got to say we need to begin to open up some of the hospitals. And you've seen the president talk about this. We saw the governor of the state of Texas talking about this, for those of you living in Texas. And I suspect if you're watching this or listening to this from your state, maybe some others in your state have talked about this, because indeed these numbers are just beginning to drop so precipitously that these hospitals actually could go into bankruptcy, and that is certainly not what is needed. So we've got to kind of consider the balance. And back to the point I made just a minute ago, I need to find that chart and post it, or send it to Karen so she can post it by tomorrow at least. If you look at the 25 metro centers, the one that just flies off the chart is New York City. No surprise there. But then the other ones pretty much hug the x-axis when compared to what's happening in New York. That's not saying that people aren't dying in those other cities. It doesn't mean that people aren't getting the COVID-19 virus or disease and things like that. But it does mean that in some respects, by planning for the worst and now experiencing something that is much less than that worst scenario, this has turned out to be something that seems to be harming some of the hospitals. So we'll talk about that in the future here on Point of View. And after the break, I want to talk about a couple of political issues. Number one, are we ever going to pass an additional money for the Paycheck Protection Program, or will Democrats still prevent that from happening? And a lot of that comes from the House, especially Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House. And something else, support now for bringing supply chains back from China is also surging in the House. It's already been, in a sense, already begun to move in the Senate, in large part because of some of you sending your letters out last week to your senators. But there seems to be a great deal of interest to bring the supply chains back also in the House of Representatives. We have more to talk about right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Let's talk about some of the political aspects of this, because after all, there are political aspects. And one of those comes from a very good piece, a commentary by Andrew Shaishia, in which he says, Democrats' callousness towards capitalism on display as small business loans dry up. And what he's talking about is something we mentioned on Friday, and that is the Paycheck Protection Program is out of money. It was out of money last Thursday. Probably was out of money before that, but that's when they finally announced it. And because they only put, it's hard to say, only put $350 billion into that plan, the plan was to add some additional money to that as well. And yet at a time when the economy, as he says, was bleeding more than 22 million jobs, according to Forbes, and when you are talking about the fact that maybe there would be a lessening of some of the national lockdown, but only some of that would happen to only a few businesses. The only thing, he says, standing between a great deal of Main Street mom and pops stores and a permanent close sign was this money that they'd run out of. And so here, of course, is the problem. And if you think about this, I have never really liked the way these two issues have been together. There's one for individuals, and there's one for the companies. Let me talk about the companies first, and that is the Paycheck Protection Plan allows various businesses, small businesses, you have to have less than 500 employees, and churches and nonprofit organizations, which could be Christian ministries, to apply for a loan that would cover 2.5 months' worth of your salary, the payroll that you would have to individuals. And if you still kept those people on the payroll a couple of weeks later, I think it's 8 weeks later, a couple of months later, probably a better way to say it, then that loan turns into a grant. And so it is a tremendous benefit to those particular companies, businesses, and others that aren't in any kind of situation where they can make money. The problem with it is that anybody can apply for that, even companies that have not been shut down. And so that's the first issue. It's relevant to another one, which maybe you are experiencing right now. I'm hearing more and more from everybody saying, I got my $1,200 check, or I didn't find somebody that got their $1,200 check. But again, that $1,200 was given to anybody, whether you lost your job or not. Now, again, I understand that trying to determine, who is eligible and who is not is something that Congress didn't want to get into. Got that. But you can see the problem. It's very easy for you to run out of $350 billion when anybody, any size other than small, can't be real large, but almost any significant mom and pop store, any church, any Christian organization, any nonprofit can apply to receive that loan that turns into a grant. That's why they ran out of money. Well, let's come back to this piece that came out here, which he talks about the fact that the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, said that a premise that reportedly led Secretary of Treasury Stephen Mnuchin to advocate legislative action in order to replenish the funding stream less than 2 weeks after the inking, or the signing, if you will, of the CARES Act. But even though there was an attempt to allocate another $250 billion, Democrats on the Hill, that would be, of course, on Congressional Hill, were not interested. And even Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell went to the floor back April 9th to introduce for unanimous consent a bill which was free of any kind of pork. It was simply to allocate another $250 billion. But instead, objecting to that were people like Maryland Senators Ben Cardin, Chris Van Hollen, and both Democrats, by the way, and actually referred to all of that as a political stunt, and then began to make demands. Well, first of all, if you think it was a stunt, what was the stunt? It was to actually replenish a program that was broke, number one. And then they said, well, we want to have other considerations. And so then they began to talk about, well, we need to have a bill that not only replenishes that fund for $250 billion, but also increases funding to local and state governments for their response to the pandemic, as well as for funds for future federal procurement of supplies for nation's hospitals. But the issue with that, which you wouldn't know if you listen to the mainstream press, but maybe you'll listen to what I have to say here, is that those dollars had already been provided for in the original CARES Act, and that really you have hundreds of billions of federal dollars that are allocated for those matters, and those dollars aren't going out the door because, as I think most of us now know, it wasn't needed. This story, matter of fact, a lot of people have talked about how the coverage of the ventilator story was so poorly done, if for no other reason than the fact that only New York City seemed like they needed ventilators, and they didn't even need half as many as we were told that they would need. That's good news, but the bottom line is some of the concerns that were raised turned out to be unwarranted. So if nothing else, while we're looking at Congress, let's point out something else. If you go to our website, we still have up, although we will be changing it shortly, I suspect, a Take Action in which it's entitled Protecting Our Pharmaceutical Supply Chain. And that's just a reminder that a majority of the ingredients and elements that are used in the drugs that maybe you take, or maybe you don't take any drugs, maybe your friends, neighbors, coworkers, family members take, are produced in China. And so the push has been to return the supply chains back to the United States. And so Senator Tom Cotton has introduced the Protecting Our Pharmaceutical Supply Chain from China Act. And some of you were nice enough to actually go and contact your two United States senators. So it looks like it will pass in the Senate. But now it looks like it also will pass fairly easily in the House because, again, there are actually three proposals. Trying to get people to agree on one might be the only issue. But so far, the Republicans in the House, let's give credit where credit is due. Somebody I mentioned the other day, the House Republican Conference Chair, Liz Cheney, who represents the state of Wyoming, has pointed out that there is bipartisan support for repatriating the supply chains. And so these interests are not only found in the Senate, but in the House. And so this would increase scrutiny for some of the mishandling of, for example, the propaganda and things of that nature. And as a result, there are a number of individuals that are now pushing that forward. And probably one of those that we want to give credit to is Representative Michael Waltz, Republican from Florida. He's the main sponsor of the House version, which is entitled Strengthening America's Supply Chain and National Security Act. So if you also wanted to contact your member of Congress in the House, that would be something you can do. Maybe we can figure out a way to do that by modifying this. But if nothing else, telling you two senators and maybe you're a representative that you think it's a good idea to bring the supply chains back to the United States, I think is a good idea. Just before I take a break, while I'm talking politics, one of the other issues is they're talking about whether or not we would provide an immunity passport. Okay, I got some real hesitations about that. It's almost like, oh, we're going to get into a situation where in the country somebody in law enforcement stops you and said, may I see your papers? But let's at least recognize that whether we have immunity passports or whether we simply implement the guidelines put together by the coronavirus task force, we've got to be able to figure out who is carrying the virus, especially if they're asymptomatic. And so if we're going to return to some semblance of normalcy, then we have to come up with these blood tests, and they are now working on those as well. And you might say, how does this work? Okay, this is Biology 101. When you get a disease, your body immediately, your immune system creates antibodies, and they then do certain things to attack the features of the virus, and these are called antigens, and so they stay within your body. That's how, at least theoretically, most of the time, you can never get the same disease again. There's some question about whether that works for COVID-19, but we'll set that aside for the moment. And so with a blood screening, it would certainly be possible to see whether or not someone is carrying the virus. And we have had some limited examples. One of those, interesting enough, in New York City, where they actually tested every pregnant woman coming in, and they found, interestingly enough, that 29 of the 33 that were actually positive for the coronavirus were asymptomatic. Now, it's a very limited test. By the way, of the 29 women who were asymptomatic, 26 of them remained asymptomatic. Only 3 of them even developed a fever. So the reality is that some people could indeed be carrying the virus and not know it. And so the goal is to make sure that we have accurate enough tests. We don't want to give people assurance, because if they get a false negative and they actually have the virus, that's the issue. But they're working on these tests right now, and that may be another way to keep us safe. We got a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that if you go to our website today, you're going to see one of the first articles, Governors Say It Is Too Soon to Open America. I'm going to postpone some of that conversation to another hour today because it's really an argument that sort of relates to this idea of testing. That is, some individuals in these various states are seeing a slight decline or even a plateauing, but they think it is too soon to open America. And the reason they're saying that is we don't have enough tests. So, of course, testing is really important, as I just mentioned a minute ago. So that is certainly the case. Very good piece that we have posted, which I just simply entitled The Loss of Liberty. This comes from an individual that we've had on this program before, Everett Piper, who is the former president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University. He's a columnist for the Washington Times, and I assumed he was still at Oklahoma Wesleyan University, so we have to catch up with him. He's been on the program with us before. Greatest threat America faces during COVID-19 pandemic is the loss of liberty. And I've already written a piece that will come out in a future Outlook on the difference between liberty and safety. So you will appreciate that one. And then one piece, the vaccine might not be developed. There's some people just simply saying, look, we may not actually get a good vaccine, or it may be a long period of time. There's also the possibility that this virus could mutate. So in some respects, this is not going to be easily dealt with. But I thought for just a minute, before we run out of time, we'll talk about the media and two good examples. We're starting to see more and more people in the mainstream media, especially those with a liberal and progressive idea, hoping that individuals will die from this. And I saw one the other day in the New York Times, which was criticizing and telling the story of this one Trump supporter, and kind of the implication all the way through was, well, this is probably, they had it coming. Okay, so that one would have taken a while to read, but then I found this one from the Miami Herald. This is the Metro columnist. Fabiola Santiago said simply that these packed beaches should work nicely to thin the ranks of the Trump DeSantis supporters in Florida who value money over health. And so the idea was that, well, I'm glad that they are actually going to open up the beaches, because most of the people on the beaches are probably supporters of President Donald Trump, supporters of Governor DeSantis, Ron DeSantis, and so I just hope they'll die. And again, it's amazing how some of these columnists can say this with impunity. There have been some people saying, well, is she going to lose her job? No. I will mention in just a minute that she did put out an apology, which probably was forced on her by the editors at the Miami Herald. But you had all sorts of individuals posting things like, you're grotesque. Of course, you have Dan Bongino saying, you're grotesque. Or I guess Donald Trump Jr. said, here's a good example of the flagrant bias that continues to go on without it being checked or even criticized. And then there are all sorts of other people that made some comments. But nevertheless, this morning, and I mean early this morning, so that tells me there probably was some pressure put on her. I deleted the tweet commenting on people on the beach because I didn't accurately convey my sentiment, and I want to apologize for the phrase I used that offended many people. Regardless of political differences, I would never wish any harm on anyone else. And, of course, you've seen some more of those. You might have seen Bette Midler that blamed all 30,000 deaths, which now is a smaller number than the actual numbers, but blamed all 30,000 deaths on President Donald Trump. And that kind of stuff just continues on all the time. And nobody on the other side would say, you know, we got Nancy Pelosi, and she is on record as telling people to go to Chinatown. And think of all the people that went to Chinatown and died of the virus, and that blood is on her hands. I mean, maybe you can find some people that say something like that, and that's inappropriate on the other side. But it just illustrates, again, how even in the midst of a pandemic like this, which in the history of the country, for those of you that are younger listening right now, there was a time in which, you know, politics stopped at the water's edge. If we had to address an enemy, whether it was Nazi Germany, whether it was the Soviet Union, we all sort of cooperated. And if we were dealing with a pandemic, that would bring us together. But it isn't this time at all. And that leads to the last point I wanted to make, and that is Bill Maher. Yes, I don't quote Bill Maher very often, but here it is. Host of HBO, atheist, warned the establishment media on his show Friday that their, he says, dishonest and sensational reporting during the coronavirus pandemic might help President Donald Trump to get reelected. Here's some of his quotes, heavily edited because he does tend to use some words that we will not use on radio. But one of those is, now that we're starting to see some hope in all this, don't hope shame me. That was a good line. He says the problem with nonstop doom and gloom is that it gives Trump the chance to play the optimist. And optimists tend to win American elections. Now, if you watch the program, at that point, he put up on the screen a graphic, and it was from President Barack Obama. Actually, I guess it was from candidate Barack Obama, because it was the 2008 campaign poster, and it had the word what? Hope. And kind of the idea, hope wins elections. And if indeed you are going to continue to do this doom and gloom, you're going to guarantee that President Donald Trump is going to get reelected. And look at what happened back in 2008, 12 years ago. Hope, was something that helped candidate Barack Obama to be a president, not only for one term, for two terms. Then Bill Maher went on and did some comparison here. He said, you remember when Representative Franklin Delano Roosevelt said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And as full as Donald Trump is, and he uses words we can't use, I see Trump riding into a second term, and then there will be no help left for you to shame. So he's really been cutting loose on the reporters. And he goes on. He says a couple things. At one point, the daily drumbeat of depression and terror veers into panic porn, he says. And he says everything looks scary if you magnify it 1,000 times. So his conclusion is we need the news to calm down, treat us like adults, because Trump calls you fake news. Don't make him right. Bill Maher, you get a point of view attaboy for the day. And he's not finished, because since I got another minute before we're finished for this hour, Bill Maher even then criticized his fellow liberals who were complaining about calling the coronavirus a Chinese virus, because he said, look, scientists who are generally pretty liberal have been naming diseases after the places they came from for a long time. This is nothing to do with Asian Americans. This has everything to do with China. We can't afford the luxury anymore of non-judginess, which is his word, towards a country with habits that kill millions of people everywhere, because it isn't the first time. SARS came from China, and the bird flu, and the Hong Kong flu, and the Asian flu, and all the rest. So if nothing else, he said, there are people out there who would rather die from the virus than call it by the wrong name. Bill Maher, I could not have agreed with you more, and most of the time we don't necessarily agree with you, but you're right there. And whether the mainstream press will listen to him, I don't know, but of course I gave you one example of the writer for the Metro column of Miami Herald, hoping that all the people out on the beach die of the coronavirus. So that's what you're getting so far from the mainstream press. And we'll see what we get today, because there'll be, of course, another press conference and another opportunity for people to criticize the president, and another opportunity for the president to call them all fake news and chew them out. And I try to avoid some of that, but I'll let you decide what you want to do with it. And so when we come back, we're going to change topics for a little while, give you a chance to learn about the historical accuracy of the New Testament. I think you'll enjoy this as we talk with Lydia McGrew. All that coming up right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us on our Monday edition here of Point of View. This first hour, we're going to talk about some things that really get back to the issue of biblical authority. I think you're really going to enjoy that conversation. But let me give you a preview of what we're going to cover the next hour. If you go to our website, you're going to see that we've posted one article having to do with a number of governors say that it may be too soon to open up America. So we're going to talk about that next hour, and also about some of these protests and what can or should be done. And a lot of that has to do with testing. So I want to give you kind of an update on some of these antibiotic testings and what can be done, what needs to be done. Matter of fact, one of the other articles we posted here, the vaccine might not be developed. There are some real questions about whether we'll find that perfect silver bullet to do this. Have one on the loss of liberty, very good piece by Dr. Everett Piper's been on the program with us before. Greatest threat to America facing during COVID-19 pandemic is the loss of liberty. Also, we'll get into some unintended consequences, not the least of which is the fact that some hospitals are headed towards bankruptcy, and we'll kind of review some of the guidelines that were set forth by the coronavirus task force, and so all of that will be taking place next hour. But as you well know, one of the things we like to do on this program is to encourage you in terms of some of the scholarship, some of the research, even some of the archaeological finds that confirm the historical accuracy of the Bible. Now, the problem has always been through the centuries is that sometimes there's been a conflict between what the Bible seems to teach and what we know from science, from history, from archaeology. And there has always been a tendency, I think, for some well-meaning Christians to say, you know what, really what the Bible meant was this, and then try to get the Bible to conform to the latest scientific theory or the lack of archaeological evidence for this particular group or tribe or whatever. And we are still seeing some of this happening today, where people are saying, you know, there's some problems that we see maybe in the Gospels, maybe in some other places, and maybe what it was is they were just using literary devices. And as we get into this, you'll see that it really challenges whether or not we believe that we have any kind of historical accuracy, because if we can't trust certain parts of what is, say, in the Gospels, why should we trust other parts? And so this is why I'm very excited about this new book by Dr. Lydia McGrew. If that name sounds familiar, I've got her other book up here, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospel and Acts. And I remember the first time that her husband, Tim McGrew, was in studio. This was a previous studio than even the one we're in right now, and began to speak on this. I thought, this is such a great piece of evidence that we can use for the internal coherency and even reporting in the Bible. So now we have, of course, two books that I think you're going to find very helpful. So we welcome back to the microphone Dr. Lydia McGrew, individual that is, of course, married to Tim McGrew, we've talked about before, who's also a philosopher and apologist. She received her Ph.D. in English from Vanderbilt University, author of the book Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and the Acts, and this new book, The Mirror and the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices. Dr. McGrew, great to have you back on Point of View.
Thank you for having me, Kerby.
You know, I'm trying to give, if you will, a simple, maybe it was a little too simplistic understanding of why you wrote the book. But throughout history, we've seen individuals that sometimes have said, well, if we've got what looks like a contradiction in the Gospels, well, we'll just say that that wasn't really recording good history. And yet we have whole books on alleged contradictions in the Bible, books on Bible difficulties. And you're really taking on this kind of new, if you will, idea that the Gospels don't necessarily have to be always taken literally because they were using literary devices. Is that kind of a fair assumption?
Yeah, that would be a correct characterization of the view I'm disagreeing with, that instead of harmonizing the alleged contradictions, or even instead of calling something a mistake, they'll just take something and they'll say, well, yeah, it is a contradiction, but we're going to relabel that as a compositional device of the time or a literary device of the time. So, you know, it's sort of like if someone trips and says, I meant to do that, we say, well, then he did it on purpose, so it's not an error anymore. That wasn't exactly quite what people had in mind, because then the factual information that's in there is still not correct.
I would certainly say so. This is a new book out. By the way, it is endorsed by all sorts of people we've had on this program in the past, people like Peter Williams and J.P. Moreland and Craig Bloomberg, as well as, of course, Donald Williams, been on many times with us before, Paul Nelson, not to mention Tom Gilson, and all sorts of other individuals. And, of course, it's even dedicated to a few individuals that, of course, have endorsed it as well, because in some respects we're talking about, again, the authority of the Bible. So, again, a dedication not only to your husband, but to J.P. Moreland and J.W. Montgomery, John Warwick Montgomery. And I thought it was kind of interesting because there is a correlation between the two, because early on in your book, you also remind us that when you wrote the book Hidden in Plain View, you quote from Colin Hemmer, and I've used him after reading your book because he documents the fact that when we look at Luke, who wrote both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, especially in those latter chapters of Acts, he actually shows that more than 80 different facts are easily verified with details about various cities, leaders, nautical details, and all the rest. So if indeed we do have evidence right now of how accurate at least Luke was as a gospel writer and a historian in the book of Acts, it seems to me that we shouldn't try to pass off the rest as just a literary device. What's your thought?
Yeah, I agree with you. Sometimes I refer to this as a schizophrenic view of the authors, or I'll call it a smorgasbord view. So we take a little bit of factual accuracy over here and a little bit of factual change over there, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I don't feel that that gives us a coherent view of the author. And you imagine someone like Luke, that's a very good example, being extremely conscientious, extremely scrupulous at certain points to get his facts correct. And then out of the blue, one moment he's going to say, you know what? Jesus really appeared to his disciples after his resurrection in Galilee, but I'm going to move that 70 or 80 miles south, and I'm just going to make it happen in Jerusalem instead. Now, to me, that's not the same author. That's not the same man. And so if I find that author to be a scrupulous person, very interested in detail and accuracy, then I'm not going to suddenly conjecture out of the blue that he was deliberately changing a fact like that.
Well said. Let's take a break. Let me just mention that this book is a little thicker than Hidden in Plain View, but it has great material. A section on masking history, then on unmasking ancient history, then the mirror, the gospel as historical reports, the mirror or the mask in the gospel examples. And so when we come back, we're going to spend some time talking about this. And I was reading, Dr. McGrew, that when you went to Vanderbilt and when you were in graduate school, that's when they started talking about postmodernism. Oh, that's a topic we've talked about on this program as well. So we'll get into that. But we'll also just try to answer some of these questions. I think people give up too quickly when they run into a contradiction. You might remember last time we had William Lane Craig on, he said, you know, when you run into a Bible difficulty, I would encourage you to research it, because once you then find the answer, because you will find eventually an answer to that, it will really increase your confirmation and your belief in God's Word. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, liberating the Gospels from literary devices, and we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Lydia McGrew right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Scott Gottlieb, former FDA administrator, concluded that this coronavirus would probably have been more deadly than the Spanish flu if it appeared in 1918. That's a reasonable conclusion based on what we know about this virus and what was not medically available back then. We currently have a debate about the severity and extent of COVID-19. Some skeptics believe the dangers have been exaggerated. Some of the models predicted more infections and more deaths than have occurred. Healthcare professionals lament that many Americans don't seem to take the warning seriously. These debates will go on for months. One thing we probably can all accept is that this virus would have taxed the medical capabilities of 1918. The world was at war, and medical facilities were nothing like what we have today. For example, a patient with COVID-19 today who needs intensive care still has a good chance of survival. We're seeing patients being rolled out of hospitals after facing significant respiratory issues. Gottlieb observes that anyone who gets admitted to a prolonged ICU stay with COVID-19 who ends up getting intubated or ends up getting a prolonged care, that's probably someone who would have died from the Spanish flu. He therefore concluded that COVID-19 not only looks like the Spanish flu in terms of its distribution across the age range, but also looks far more fearsome. At the very least, his observation should make you feel grateful that you not only live in the 21st century, but that you live in the U.S. It has been popular among many politicians to criticize America's healthcare system and to attack Big Pharma. Yet these observations from the former FDA commissioner is a reminder of the benefits we enjoy in this country at this time. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continuing our conversation today with Dr. Lydia McGrew. The book is entitled The Mirror or the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices. We have information about her as well as information about the book, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Each one of these chapters has a very good summary, so even as you read through that, if you said, okay, I don't know that I got that key point, but some really good questions. And I guess part of it has to do with this whole idea of so-called supposed alleged contradictions in the Bible, or to put a different way, to pick the title of one of these books, why are there differences in the Gospels? Well, just think about this. If you are a police officer, and some of our listeners, you are police officers, you see that when there's an accident, you'll interview one person, they say, well, somebody was traveling down north in a blue truck and they hit this white car. And then you talk to someone else and saying, as I was coming up from the south, I saw this blue Ford coming to me. Somebody else I saw it was a white Hyundai that was hit. And as a result, you say, well, I got slightly different explanations, but if I put them all together, they don't contradict, they actually complement. Then if somebody said, well, and then shortly thereafter the ambulance came, you say, well, no, it was like about 10 minutes before the ambulance came, which gets us, Lydia, into the issue of compression. And that is the arguments that are being made right now is not only do sometimes they do the gospel writers write them in different order, but they compress the time. And after reading some of these books that you're critiquing, I'm glad they don't critique some of the things I write every day, because you obviously, when you're trying to tell a story, leave certain details out because you're trying to get to the point. And because we see differences, this is kind of the reason that you've had these people develop these literary devices. Is that fair?
Right, and I think also sometimes there is an equivocation. It's what we philosophers call an equivocation, where you have one word with two meanings. So take the word you might tell a story and just leave out some details, but that doesn't actually mean that you're trying to give the impression that it took a shorter period of time. And the word compression could be used for that. You just left something out. But it could also be used to mean that you were really trying to put it all in a shorter period of time.
Sure.
Now, some of these authors, they'll equivocate. So look at the end of Luke, Luke 24. It is kind of rushed. It's kind of rushed there. But one of the people I'm interacting with, which is Dr. Michael Licona, he says that Luke actually literally put all the events on Easter Sunday. But now that really would be a contradiction, because in Acts 1 it says that Jesus was on earth for 40 days. Yeah. So then Luke would be contradicting himself. So I would say Luke is compressing in the benign sense of merely leaving out some details, writing in a more rushed way, but not in the other sense of literally trying to put everything in a shorter period of time. We've got to keep those distinct.
And I love that illustration because, okay, Luke contradicted himself when he wrote the book of Acts. No, actually, it's, if you will, it's Luke chapter 1 and Luke book 1 and then Acts book 2. I mean, these are sort of a continuity, and it's a good illustration. And really, in your first section here, you're talking about you're asking, first of all, the question, what if the Gospels were only based on true events? Oh, that's a good concept there. And ultimately, it gets back to our belief in the authority of the Bible and the inerrancy of the Bible, doesn't it?
Well, I have a whole chapter on inerrancy. Chapter 4 is about inerrancy. Yes. And what's interesting is you can have a reported view of the Gospels where you say they're never deliberately changing anything, which is completely compatible with inerrancy, even if it doesn't entail inerrancy. So you can have people who don't call themselves inerrantists who totally agree with the inerrantists, that you're never going to have a gospel author who's coming along there and saying, hey, I know it happened this way, but I'm going to make it happen that way instead in my story. And I think this is a place where certain non-inerrantists can actually make a common cause with very strong, old-fashioned inerrantists like Dr. Montgomery against a redefinition of the term inerrancy, where we say, well, we're going to call it inerrant, but that just means they did it on purpose, because that's certainly not what was ever intended by inerrancy.
Good point. And in that chapter, you also not only talk about the fact that we, in the past, have talked about the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy, for example, with people like Norm Geisler when he was alive, but also they had a whole section on hermeneutics. Now, I don't want my audience to run away when they hear that big word, but it's how you interpret the Scriptures. And we all understand that when we say, for example, I get sometimes on secular shows, they said, do you believe every word in the Bible is true? And I go, yes. And then they'll point out, well, in the Psalms it says, well, the trees clap their hands. You believe they actually had hands? No. I mean, that gets back to what you call hermeneutics or biblical interpretation. There are times when you can see in the Psalms or other passages which are using a metaphor, but you can't use that same kind of hermeneutic or that kind of interpretation when you're looking at the Gospels, because it certainly seems to me, and again, we'll just come back to our favorite here, Luke, when he is writing the book of Acts, it's obviously history. When he's writing the Gospel of Luke, it's obviously history. So it seems difficult to then all of a sudden try to inject these ideas of literary forms. Is that fair?
Yes, it really is, because the way I will put this sometimes is if the Gospels and Acts in the Bible are not history, nothing is. So you get, for example, let's take John, just to take a different author. Sure. When Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, and they take up stones to stone him, or he says, I and the Father are one, they take up stones to stone him. John even tells you where he was when that happened. Now, one scholar named Craig Evans has said that in some of these places, John makes Jesus look like the allegorical character of Lady Wisdom in the book of Proverbs. And I can guarantee you that never in the book of Proverbs does it tell you which part of the city in specific, like, by the sheep gate, where Lady Wisdom is standing. It'll say by the corner or something like that, and the crossing of the ways, she cries. But Jesus definitely does not look like an allegorical figure in the Gospel of John at all. So I think you're quite right, and that's why the statement on biblical hermeneutics was written, was to block that kind of thing where you're literally going to take a document that for all the world looks like it's completely historical in the Bible, and you're going to dehistoricize that entire book, or even you're going to dehistoricize selectively parts of it. Well, this part over here is history, but suddenly, because, we looked and read the mind of the author in a way that he didn't make obvious at all, we're going to say he didn't really mean that part to be historical. That is actually extremely implausible. I would say it is implausible from a historical and an objective point of view, not just from a theological point of view.
Let's, if we can, give at least those people their due. Some have been on this program with us as well, because in your section on unmasking ancient history, you point out that sometimes these literary devices were very useful, which is why I liked your kind of flow diagram or logic diagram on page 180, because in some respects, well, what if you have a discrepancy, or was it a possibility? But let's talk about for just a minute, because when you talk about, for example, some of these Greco-Roman biographies, what do we find in other literature other than the Bible?
Well, that was part of what was interesting, and it's why the book is so thick. As you mentioned, it's kind of a thick book, because I am kind of tackling this argument at several different levels. I'm going to some of that Greco-Roman literature as well. I was astonished to find how little of this compositional device theory even applies there. So interestingly, even when I read Plutarch, I sometimes will say, well, it just looks like Plutarch can be harmonized the way I would harmonize the Gospels themselves. I don't really see a contradiction here. And that's not because I'm committed to the inerrancy of Plutarch. I'm just trying to do good history. Yes. Or I might say, right, it's too complicated to say it's a literary device to remove something. Or I might say, because nobody's committed to the inerrancy of Plutarch, maybe he just made an ordinary mistake, but that's not a literary device either. So very seldom, the only thing that I found was that there were some Greco-Roman authors who made up speeches to kind of show off at times, but the speeches in the Bible don't look like that at all, these kind of show-off speeches. Other than that, a lot of these alleged devices I just did not even find in the Greco-Roman literature. And then I further argued that even if they had existed, the gospel authors would have had reason not to use them either. So I'm kind of tackling that argument at every level. And that's why it took so much research. It
certainly did. And I will, since I'm an author of books, tell you I've looked at every single page. Can't say that I read every part of that, but I certainly am very familiar with the argument. And when we come back, we're going to finish off some of those very important arguments. But as we go to a break, let me mention a couple of things. First of all, we have a link to her website. It's lydiamcgrew.com. You don't even have to know how to spell that, because we have it on the website. If you find yourself saying, this might be helpful, especially if you're a pastor or a Bible teacher, Bible fellowship leader, small group leader, this might be something I really like to know, because I'm starting to hear people questioning whether or not some of the things in the gospel are historical. You can get a copy of the book, and we have it linked so that you can order it if you would like to do so. And when we come back, we're going to continue looking at a little bit more of this very important issue of the mirror or the mask, liberating the Gospels from literary devices. And let me also commend to you the book that I tend to quote from quite often, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. Very powerful argument for the internal proof of the Scriptures. We'll be back right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Lydia McGrew. And for just a few minutes, Dr. McGrew, let's see if we can talk about, first of all, on your website and your husband's website. This has just been kind of a banner couple of years for individuals because of all the things that are happening. I'm holding up right now my little booklet on archaeology, and this is one that we've made available to our donors for a number of reasons, because this has been kind of a banner couple of years in terms of all the archaeological investigation. But let me come back to you, Tim McGrew and Lydia McGrew, because he's also, and you together with him, have been finding some of these great apologetic arguments, sometimes from a century ago. Some of that, I believe, ended up in your book, Hidden in Plain View. So whether we're talking about archaeology, whether we're talking about apologetics, there are so many blessings that we in the 21st century enjoy compared to what it was like to maybe be a Christian in the 19th century and have people say, you say that there is a Hittite nation. We don't have any archaeological evidence of that. Or, Luke says that Licinius was a tetrarch of Abila, and we don't have any historical evidence. He made a mistake. And now we're finding so many good verifications of the historical accuracy of the Bible, aren't we?
Yes, we definitely are making, especially some Old Testament discoveries as far as, a seal ring and that kind of thing that have come to light, Hezekiah's tunnel, the Dead Sea Scrolls, those kinds of things that have come to light. One of the interesting things that happened, though, was that in the 18th and 19th centuries, they had some of these arguments, like undesigned coincidences that you've mentioned, that their leaders were out there very boldly making. And then after higher criticism became more popular, those fell out of favor. They just kind of dropped off the map in a fashion sense, not because they were refuted. And so that's something that Tim and I and Peter Williams and J. Warner Wallace have been bringing back. A couple that I bring back in addition to undesigned coincidences in the Mirror of the Mask are what I call unexplained allusions and unified personalities. And those are both really cool, two old arguments that we are renewing.
Well, again, those just great material, and again argues for the internal inspiration that you have here. There's kind of internal arguments. Does the Bible contradict itself, and how does it reinforce itself? And those are some of those undesigned coincidences. You have external evidence. Of course, that's things like archaeology and history. And then you have bibliographic evidence about the textual material, but those are all important. But I thought I might move to one of your chapters on devices, discrepancies, and just differences, because it reminded me, at one point you have this proverb, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. In other words, look for the common explanation. One of the golden rules of biblical interpretation is when the plain sense of Scripture makes common sense, seek no other sense, lest it result in nonsense. And so in some respects, you're trying to say, wait a minute, if we can come up with a reasonable common sense answer to this, why are we looking for zebras when we have horses and their hoofbeats, right?
Right, exactly. So, for example, some people will say that John moved Jesus' day of crucifixion, that he deliberately tried to make it look like it took place on a different day of the month,
yes,
to make Jesus look more like the Passover lamb. And one of the reasons that's not common sense is that John, in that context, never mentions Passover lamb. And it's interesting, of course, way back at the beginning, John the Baptist says, "Behold the Lamb of God." But around the crucifixion, there's no mention of the Passover lambs at all. And so it's this very, I would say it's a zebra explanation. It's this very esoteric, secret, symbolic explanation that John was trying to change the day. Whereas if you look at the work of, for example, Craig Blomberg, he's written about how those verses in John that are taken to mean that he was talking about a different day, those are much more easily explained. For example, in terms of the fact that there were meals that could be called the Passover that the leaders would have wanted to eat during the day, and so they didn't want to be ceremonially defiled by entering Pilate's hall. So there are answers to all these kinds of things. Instead of saying, hey, we've read John's mind, and he was trying to change the day in this really subtle way that his readers were going to somehow figure out, that's really not a common explanation.
Very good. One of the things I do appreciate in this chapter is, of course, the flow chart that you've put together. I mentioned it before because it says, okay, if these accounts have differences, then, you take a series of yes, no's, and I won't go through all of those, but just simply to say that you come to the conclusion that if you get some yeses and no's, that proves that it's not a fictionalized literary device. And so it just once again enforces this idea. But one of the things I thought maybe I'll move on to, because I do want to get to part 3, is what about this idea of the evangelists, the gospel writers, as reporters? Sometimes, Lydia, there are people that think that maybe inspiration or even the idea of reporting means that it's just like an actual almost tape-recorded version of that. And so sometimes we have to set that aside and recognize that though we believe in the authority of the Bible and the inspiration of the Bible and the inerrancy of the Bible, it doesn't mean that every word was in that word choice as well, like a tape recorder, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think what we get sometimes, so I talked before about equivocation. Now I'm going to talk about false dilemma. This is something else that philosophers talk about. A false dilemma is where you say, well, you've either got to do this or you accept this ridiculous view or you've got to accept my view. And this is a false dilemma. So the false dilemma would be either you have to accept that the authors had a tape-recorded version of every single word that Jesus said, or else you have to accept that they were making up words and putting them into his mouth. Now, that's a false dilemma. And we will see sometimes that I can give a very accurate, historically recognizable paraphrase of what someone said. And I like to emphasize that phrase, historically recognizable. That's not absolutely word for word. But if you had been there, you would say, oh, that was the time when Jesus said that. I recognize this dialogue that's reported in John 8 or something like that. So we don't have to accept this sort of extreme view that they were elaborating and putting their theological elaborations in Jesus' mouth in order to avoid saying that it's absolutely word for word tape recorded. Instead, we can just have the way that normal people would normally think of paraphrasing as something that you do, but you really still try to be quite faithful to what the person said at a particular time and a particular place.
And again, that's in that chapter of the evangelist as honest reporters. And for some of you parents, you've sent one of your kids off to college and they took a Religion 101 class. And what oftentimes I've seen happen is a professor there will set up what we call a straw man, that they'll maybe say that this is some kind of extreme view, that this is not how Jesus spoke, and they'll sort of make fun of the reportage model. And then young people say, well, I don't know if I really believe the Bible anymore. And so this is really a great resource to maybe contradict the ideas that sometimes young people show up with after they've gone off to college. But I just thought before we take a break, I wanted to maybe do a correlation between this book, The Mirror and the Mask, and Hidden in Plain View, because you talk about undesigned coincidences versus literary devices. So talk about that, because in that sense, both these books sort of come together in an interesting way, don't they?
Yes, they're very complementary because they're both supporting the idea that the Gospels are just honestly reporting the truth. So, for example, one of the undesigned coincidences hidden in plain view concerns the night when Jesus was betrayed. And Luke reports that Jesus said, I am among you as the one who serves. But he doesn't say what exactly Jesus meant by that. But then when we go to John, we find that Jesus washed their feet on that night. And so that explains what Jesus meant when he said, I am among you as the one who serves. That's an undesigned coincidence. But some scholars have said that Luke actually moved the quarrel that the disciples were having. They didn't really have a quarrel that night. Luke moved that from a different time and put it on the night of the Last Supper. But actually, when we see the undesigned coincidence, we say, no, they were just fighting again. Like your children, they do fight on more than one occasion. And so, Jesus had to address it again. And one of the things he did to address it was to wash their feet, and then to say, this is how you should be with one another, like I am, that I am among you as the one who serves. So when we see those undesigned coincidences fitting together, that really opposes that compositional device view of the author deliberately changing the facts.
Very good. And again, I might just mention that's section there, I guess it's on page 268, foot washing and the dispute, and it goes on and explains that. So there's a sense in which the previous book helps even answer some of the questions in the current book. But let's take a break. We come back, let me take a phone call or two, 1-800-351-1212. I suspect many of you are just sitting back and listening and saying, I'm so grateful we have really smart people dealing with these issues because, I take this on faith, but it's nice to know it's faith based on very good evidence. And this is, I think, just an incredible time right now for biblical authority, biblical interpretation, and all of the rest because we have so much more at our disposal. So, again, benefit from some of these books and resources, but we might take some phone calls, too. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Dr. Lydia McGrew, The Mirror or the Mask. And let's take a phone call or two. We'll go to Texas, KCTA. Dennis, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. What would you like to add?
Hi, Kirby. I just wanted to say I just broke in your program a little earlier ago, and I was just talking to a friend of mine that says, the Bible's got a lot of mistakes in it. I said, no, it doesn't. I don't believe that. The modern translations, 232 of them, are full of omissions. Like the NIV, for instance, I have a book here called the NIV, an in-depth documentation of apostasy. It says there's 64,098 omissions in the NIV as opposed to the KJV. KJV is the one that I got saved out of. And I had never heard of a Bible before. They opened this thing up and showed me where Jesus died on the cross for my sins, was buried, rose again, shed his blood, and I saw that, and I got saved that night.
Power
Changed
of the
my
word,
whole life.
right? It's living and active, a double-edged sword, right?
Absolutely. And if I told my friend Bradley, I said, listen, you got a rubber sword, pal. That's our defensive or offensive weapon.
Yes.
And another thing, you got to rightly divide it. Otherwise, you wind up a Jehovah's Witness or a Catholic or a Pentecostal or a Mormon. We're debating Mormons this weekend at our church.
Well, let me get back to Lydia. I want to give her just enough time to kind of make some comments there. I think you got some good points we can get to another time, but that's part of the issue is that we have seen, Dr. McGrew, individuals that have gone off and maybe had their faith shaken. Let me take an extreme example, Bart Ehrman. They hear something like that and go, oh, well, I don't know if I can trust the Bible anymore. But some of these other ideas that are saying, well, not all of it is historically accurate, but that's okay because these are just literary devices. After a while, it sort of feels like, I hate to use this illustration, but it's the best one I can come up with. It's like, you get a cheap sweater and you start pulling the thread, and pretty soon you pull and pull and pull, and you end up with just a pile of yarn. And there's a sense in which once you start down this road of saying, well, I'm not so sure the Bible's accurate, then I think you get into real difficulties. And unfortunately, over the years, I've run into a lot of young people that were real strong, committed Christians in their youth group, went off to university, and after a while began to question the Bible, and they don't seem to be very interested in the gospel anymore, right?
Yeah. Well, Bart Ehrman is a great danger. He writes, awfully charmingly, and he's a very prolific author. And if you go and you just go to your public library, you want a book about Jesus, chances are you're going to find Jesus Interrupted or something like this by Ehrman. And a lot of these theories that I'm talking about were developed in a sense because the people believed that was a good way to respond to Ehrman. Several of the people I am disagreeing with here actually have personally debated Bart Ehrman on the stage.
Yes.
And I just disagree that the best way to debate Bart Ehrman is to make concessions to him. I would instead take a far more forward approach and say, Bart, you're just wrong. That's not a contradiction, and it can be harmonized. And guess what? Harmonization is a good historical method. It's not some desperate thing we're doing because we're terrified we're going to lose our precious Bible book. It's actually the way to be a good historian. And just to go for the jugular, if I can use a metaphor there, with Bart, instead of saying, well, those are really difficult discrepancies, but it's okay because it was a compositional device. I do not believe that's the best way to counter Dr. Ehrman's attacks upon the Bible.
And just before we run out of time here, let's talk about your last chapter, because the way I first heard about this were people saying, well, these resurrection accounts seem to have some discrepancies, and so that's okay because these were literary devices. And I know we could spend an entire program just on this last chapter on the resurrection accounts. But can you give us a brief summary? Because that's a place where it surfaces oftentimes the most, because people say, well, how many women, the angels, when did Jesus appear, and those kinds of things. But again, your attempt in that is to say we don't need these literary devices. There are ways to easily resolve what seem to be discrepancies in the resurrection accounts.
Yes, and here I want to make a couple of recommendations. A book by John Wenham called Easter Enigma is, I don't happen to agree with every single thing he imagines there, but it's what they call a proof of concept that these really can be fitted together. And another thing is that if you look up the White Horse Inn, I was on there with Shane Rosenthal, and we did an entire session on the alleged discrepancies in the Gospels, in the specifically Easter accounts. So that was a lot of fun. So let me give an example here. In Matthew, it talks about in Matthew 28, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary come to the tomb, and they go in. Then it just starts saying they, and they see the angel, and the angel says, he's not here, but he is risen. And it says they ran and they saw Jesus and so forth on their way to go tell the disciples. Now you go over to John and you read it, and it says that the women came, and then it says that Mary, when she saw the stone rolled away, she ran to Simon Peter and to the disciple whom Jesus loved and says, they've taken away my Lord. And she comes back later then and sees Jesus later on when she's weeping by the tomb. So if you assumed from Matthew that Mary Magdalene is there the whole time, you would have a very different view of how she met Jesus, because she's not weeping and sad anymore. She's running away joyfully to tell the disciples. So that would seem like a contradiction. But all that Matthew says is they. He says that Mary Magdalene came, and then he just says they. He doesn't say that she didn't leave. So I think we just have to get this idea in our heads that these women were not chained together at the wrist, that they could go different places. And so then you can think of the camera in Matthew as following along with what the other women saw. And you can think of the camera in John as following along with Mary Magdalene as she ran back. And she just saw Jesus separately from the other women when she did not yet realize that he was risen. And that fits together actually really, really economically. There are a lot of these. We talked a little bit about the end of Luke. I believe that Luke was getting rushed there, and we don't know why. He might have been trying to catch a boat to send his manuscript to Theophilus, or he might have been running out of scroll. But what we find at the end, the very end of Luke 24, starting at about verse 44, are just these words that just mean but or and. But this happened, and that happened. Those words don't necessarily mean that it all happened immediately. And so he's just trying to fit in a sort of a summary of what happened. And in fact, that's why in Acts 1, I believe he kind of said to himself, okay, I got a new scroll now, and I want to make sure that Theophilus realizes this really did take 40 days. So he's not trying to put it all on Easter Sunday. That's what I call that benign compression, where you just write shortly and without detail. So that's another example of an alleged discrepancy. They certainly were not out there at nighttime looking up and going, is that Jesus rising up and ascending? It's dark. I can't see. No, of course not. That didn't all happen on that one night. So I think these are pretty readily harmonizable, but it just takes a certain amount of spade work.
Let me again just mention that not only do we have information about this book, we've had a link to Cogent Christianity. There's another interview with Lydia McGrew, and she mentioned another one there as well. So lots of great resources if you find yourself saying, I'd like to learn a little bit more about the book. If you'd like to purchase it, we have that on the website. Of course, we have her website, so you can also find out about Hidden in Plain View. And I want you to say hi to your husband, Tim. We've always enjoyed him in studio, and I haven't had you in studio yet, but it's been great to have you by phone. And thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me, Kerby, and I will give your greetings to Tim, and I'm sure he would want me to give his to you as well.
Well, that's all we have this hour. Now we'll get back into the real issue that a lot of you are addressing, and that is the pandemic. And we've got a lot of bit of material there. We'll give you a brief summary of the guidelines that came out on Thursday and Friday. Also, some of your states now have guidelines, so we'll try to give you a brief overview there. We'll look at the backlash to what some of the governors have required in some of their orders. And so that whole issue is, do we exercise civil disobedience? Do we protest? The president has been somewhat sympathetic to some of the protesters, so I want to hear from those of you in the next hour. Do you agree with those protests? Are you ready to get back to work, or are you convinced that we need to stay locked down longer? So we just have a lot to cover, and we will do so in the next hour, right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to talk about, of course, some of the guidelines that the president has set down and that came from the coronavirus task force. Also, I've posted some articles. Governors say it is too soon to open America, so that gets into the issue of testing. And we have a number of governors from Maryland, Virginia, New York, a number of places that are disagreeing with the president, so we'll certainly get into that. Also, one which I think you will appreciate. This comes from Dr. Everett Piper. He's been on the program with us before. Used to be the president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University. I need to kind of catch up with where he is now. The greatest threat America faces during COVID-19 pandemic is the loss of liberty. And, of course, I think my first caller here wants to talk about this idea of quarantine. You might remember that there has been a real pushback from some of these particular orders. Let me focus on Michigan for just a moment, which gets me to my little booklet that we just put out here on civil disobedience, because that relates to the fact that I love what the head of the Operation Gridlock, which descended on the capital of Michigan the other day, said, quarantine is when you restrict the movement of sick people. Tyranny is when you restrict the movement of healthy people. And I think our first caller wants to address that issue. So let's go to the state of Florida. Tom, thank you for joining us. What are your comments?
Well, I would say first and foremost that executive orders are not law. Secondly, I would say we are commanded by God to work. We are commanded by God to go to church. So we have to obey God rather than man. Now, my question for you is, the Declaration of Independence states that we have the unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How are we supposed to live life, exercise liberty, and pursue happiness if we're under house arrest?
Well, first of all, we're not in house arrest. It is, back to your point, most of these orders were not under law. And this has, of course, been the big challenge right now. So I'm going to get into that for just a moment, because even as we had Kelly Shackelford on, you might remember that he was pointing out that most of these are, if you will, suggestions. And then he came back a couple of days later and said, well, many of these orders actually do have penalties associated with them. And of course, we've also documented, as you well know, if you've listened to this program for a while, and I think some of our listeners certainly know, that when these orders came out, sometimes the police, as much as we love people in law enforcement, so don't take this as a blanket criticism at all of law enforcement, but some individuals certainly went too far. And the examples we've used are where you had a former Colorado State Patrol officer who we actually have caught on video being handcuffed in front of his 6-year-old daughter because they were out there playing catch on a essentially nearly empty softball field, placed into a patrol car. Of course, the example I love to use from California is the individual that was out there paddle boarding and then came to the beach and was chased down by the police and handcuffed, and others that were given citations for watching the sunset on the beach. And, of course, we've talked about some of these issues, as you mentioned, church. Friday, we spent a fair amount of time talking about some of these religious liberty cases. Probably the most extreme was the mayor in Louisville, Kentucky, that specifically prohibited churches from holding in even drive-in services where they had their windows rolled up. And I do love what that one district judge issued an order completely blocking the enforcement of that prohibition. It started out with this ruling on Holy Thursday. An American mayor criminalized the communal celebration of Easter. That sentence is one that this court never expected to see outside the pages of a dystopian novel or perhaps the pages of The Onion. But he goes on to then talk about the mayor's order. And then at the end say the mayor's decision is stunning and it is beyond all reason unconstitutional. So back to the point, it does seem to me that there are some people that are starting to say, you know what, it is time to end this lockdown. Let's try to do this in a safe way, and let's try to come up with some reasonable guidelines. And so just before we take a break, and then I'll take some more phone calls, let's remind everybody what are those guidelines that the president has put down. Many of you perhaps are in states right now where that is taking place. And phase one is where all vulnerable individuals, that would be elderly and those with pre-existing medical conditions, should self-quarantine. When in public, we should still have social distancing. Non-essential travel should be avoided. And schools and youth camps remain closed, which I fear are really going to devastate some of these Christian camps. And restaurants, gyms, and movie theaters might, and I put might, reopen under very strict social distancing and cleaning procedures. And we talked a little bit about that on Friday. By the way, if you'd like to see these guidelines, we did post those Fridays, so you can read them for yourself. There's 18 pages. Phase two, all vulnerable individuals still self-quarantine. When in public, individuals should maximize physical distancing and avoid gatherings of more than 50 people. Non-essential travel then is permitted. Schools and youth camps can reopen, which I fear might not be till the fall for almost all. Business is still encouraged to use teleworking and maybe still close down common areas. And some restaurants, gyms, and movie theaters might operate under less strict social distancing. And then you have phase three, where vulnerable individuals can resume normal activities. Trips to nursing homes can resume, and we're, in a sense, back to normal. A lot of people have criticized these guidelines because they said they're nothing more than a PowerPoint presentation. They really don't have any teeth in them. But, you know, that gets back to a couple of issues that we've talked about. That is, the federal government only has certain powers which are delegated to it. The rest of the powers are actually reserved to the states and the people. So a lot of these changes are going to take place from the governors and the mayors. As you well know, this last week, we actually had a take action item for you to contact your 2 United States senators about the pharmaceutical supply chain. Interestingly enough, a little bit later this hour, if we have time, I'll talk about the fact that that seems to be moving ahead also in the House of Representatives. So your letters to the senator or emails to the senators seem to be working, but now we also see an interest in this in the House, which is why we'll probably move on to maybe providing an action item for you to contact your governor. After all, we have people listening to this program that listen in 42 different states, but we have a way in which it will surface the email address for your governor so you can express your opinion to him or her. And so that is another very important issue. And, of course, there are some that are right now challenging the president. That's my first article, saying that until we get a lot more testing, we do not think it is safe to actually open up the various aspects of the economy. And so some states, we just got a call from Tom in Florida, Ohio, Texas, and a couple of others are thinking about this, whereas there's still a fair amount of resistance in places like Virginia, Maryland, Michigan, and a few other places. So we'll see where that all plays out. But if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at this whole issue of quarantine, this whole issue of lockdown, and then most importantly, have we done some things that have actually hurt the hospitals, because some hospitals seem to be headed into bankruptcy. Why did that happen? We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Scott Gottlieb, former FDA administrator, concluded that this coronavirus would probably have been more deadly than the Spanish flu if it appeared in 1918. That's a reasonable conclusion based on what we know about this virus and what was not medically available back then. We currently have a debate about the severity and extent of COVID-19. Some skeptics believe the dangers have been exaggerated. Some of the models predicted more infections and more deaths than have occurred. Healthcare professionals lament that many Americans don't seem to take the warning seriously. These debates will go on for months. One thing we probably can all accept is that this virus would have taxed the medical capabilities of 1918. The world was at war, and medical facilities were nothing like what we have today. For example, a patient with COVID-19 today who needs intensive care still has a good chance of survival. We're seeing patients being rolled out of hospitals after facing significant respiratory issues. Gottlieb observes that anyone who gets admitted to a prolonged ICU stay with COVID-19 who ends up getting intubated or ends up getting a prolonged care, that's probably someone who would have died from the Spanish flu. He therefore concluded that COVID-19 not only looks like the Spanish flu in terms of its distribution across the age range, but also looks far more fearsome. At the very least, his observation should make you feel grateful that you not only live in the 21st century, but that you live in the U.S. It has been popular among many politicians to criticize America's healthcare system and to attack Big Pharma. Yet these observations from the former FDA commissioner is a reminder of the benefits we enjoy in this country at this time. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once a minute. Again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the things we're going to talk about is some of the testing that needs to take place if indeed we do have a push towards opening up the government and the economy. And if we indeed do that, there are some that are even talking about having maybe an immunity passport, which kind of gets into my little booklet here on privacy and surveillance. Because right now we have in other countries around the world surveillance cameras. They're using various apps that go into these smartphones, and even this idea of immunity passport, which I've got some real questions about. I never thought I'd be living in a country where if somebody in law enforcement pulls you over, they say, "Papers, please." But nevertheless, those are some issues we'll talk about, and also talk about, okay, if indeed we are going to actually bring us back to some level of normalcy, then we need to have some pretty accurate tests. And a lot of people are talking about these antibody tests, so we'll talk about that in just a minute. And, of course, talk about how some of the governors are pushing back against some of the recommendations that the president, the vice president, Anthony Fauci, and Dr. Deborah Birx have actually issued. And so to get some perspective, let's go to Daniel. Daniel, I understand you're a registered nurse. Love to get your comments calling in from Georgia on the Good News Network.
Yes, sir. The question is, are people really taking the coronavirus seriously? The fact of the matter is, I just listened to a previous caller say, that our rights are being infringed on. As a nurse, I can move about as I need to, as long as where I'm going is justified, whether that's home to work or get something to eat, because my shifts are 12 or 14 hours long, depending on, what shift I am to work. But I noticed that people are not taking it seriously, even in my home state. This is not even a state that we're ready to even enter into the first phase of the gating in the new guidelines that are being laid out. They're already gathering together like there's no problem. Nobody's wearing masks or practicing social distancing. So the scary thing about that is people get a false sense of security and then give the virus a chance to, again, proliferate because they're not given enough time. And the other thing is that they're really still learning about this virus. They call it a novel virus. It is novel because of its mutations. It's different things. It looks like SARS or, people compare it to the Spanish flu, but they're really not going to understand this now until years later after they've had time to study it in the lab. Right now, everything is rushed and hurried. It's kind of like fast-tracking drugs in the pharmaceutical industry. So what I'm finding is that people are talking a lot about things but not really looking at it,
And I might just mention my third article is one on the vaccine might not even be developed. We recognize that, I'll talk about a little bit later, some things that seem to have some possible promise, but this is going to be with us for some time. And for those of you watching online, I'll hold up my mask because, first of all, this studio is in Dallas, and you cannot walk into any building in Dallas without a mask on. I've been using it anyway, but now all of us wear masks. So word to the wise, don't spread it to someone else, and don't make it easier for you to catch it. And that is something that needs to take place. So, first of all, Daniel, I know you're one of those people out there on the front lines, and we've encouraged people to pray for first responders, for medical personnel. And we appreciate the work that you are doing because in many cases you're putting your own health and life on the line, even when you go into the places where you work today, aren't you?
Yes, sir. That's the other thing is that people also have seemed to take this as an opportunity to politicize this, whether they're on the right or the left. And it really doesn't matter about the right or the left when you're worried about people dying. It doesn't matter about an election. Everybody's still going to have their opinions when all of this kind of settles down. But our normalcy that we go back to is going to be a lot different than what we're used to, and people are still thinking this is the old way of doing things. There is. Dr. Fauci just talked about it being a new normal. I don't know what that entails as far as what's coming down the pipe as far as regulations and how much government actually steps in. But I just listened to you talk about, passports based on our biology. That's scary to me because, I'm a big advocate for health and for research into medicines and vaccines and things that will help people, but I am not for an officer of the law being able to pull me over and ask proof of my immune status.
I know.
That is where we're getting into a police state.
I know, and this is the real issue. Daniel, I appreciate, first of all, your comments you made, and it's one of the reasons why you're seeing some of this pushback. And as he points out, it has been politicized, and we were just talking with somebody from Florida. And just a while back, I was on another part of a program talking about the columnist in the Miami Herald. There's a Metro columnist that said, now that these beaches in Florida are packed, this should work nicely to thin the ranks of Trump and DeSantis supporters, talking about the supporters of President Donald Trump and Governor Ron DeSantis. Later, she sort of apologized, but nevertheless, you got these kinds of comments being made all the time. And it just seems like everything is politicized. So just before I take another phone call, let me at least put on the table some other things to think about. And one of our first articles is, again, how governors in some of the states hardest hit by the coronavirus have been sparring with President Donald Trump. I can't even imagine what the press conference is going to look like today. Even in New York, which has been really the ground zero, if you will, one of the worst of all the hot spots. Now New York is testing about 2,000 people a day. If you do your math right, that's 14,000 per week. But you have 19 million residents in the state. And then you've had a number of other governors. Let me take the Republican governor from Maryland, who said that the claims by Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence that we have plenty of tests were absolutely false. You have the Democratic governor of Virginia saying the idea that states have enough tests are delusional. And ultimately, we're going to have to think about something that maybe would be more like an antibody test in the first place. And so let me kind of give Biology 101 real quickly. That is, when you get a particular disease, let's take a virus like COVID-19 disease, then in some respects what you have is that your then immune system creates molecules called antibodies, which would then target some of the unique features of the virus called antigens, and those antibodies then persist in your body for a long period of time. So that gives the opportunity then to actually test individuals to see if they either have the virus or had the virus. And the reason I say had is because the theory, in the past at least, has been if you catch that virus, if you get that virus, you build antibodies for it, you won't get that virus again, you won't get that disease again. There's now some question about that, but I'll leave that to another discussion in another day. But to give you a perspective on that, because they did test for every woman coming into the labor and delivery wards in New York City, they actually were able to find some women that did test positive for having the antibodies. And as a result, here's the interesting set of numbers. 29 out of the 33 were asymptomatic. That is, they showed no symptoms. Of that 29, 26 stayed asymptomatic. Only 3 developed a fever. So if that is even something you can extrapolate from, and again, that's such a small sample, but it does illustrate that a good number of these individuals had the virus, showed no symptoms, and as a result tested positive. The problem with these various antibody tests that they're developing is they've got to be very accurate, because you can imagine if you gave a test to somebody who was going to come into your place of work and that individual tested negative, but they really were positive, that could be a real problem. But the key to what we were just talking about a minute ago with Daniel, the so-called gating features, I think are going to require that we have some kind of basic antibody test. And so that is the case there as well. Let's take another phone call. We'll head to South Carolina this time. And Kent, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Yes, thanks. I'm calling in from WAGP 88.7 The Light in Beaufort. And like Daniel was saying, and you've been talking about immunity cards, I think that you're talking about a de facto police state there in one aspect. And that's quite problematic, as my former battalion commander, my former Marine, I've been over in Iraq, would say, we didn't fight for this. And it just makes me wonder, what happened to the American culture?
Well, it is changing, isn't it? And that's why I posted this piece by Everett Piper. He said maybe the greatest threat is not the disease, but the loss of liberty. And that's something we're starting to write about. And that's, matter of fact, the next issue of Outlook, because I think that's a big issue. But go ahead. And first of all, thank you for your service.
Yeah. I appreciate that, Kerby. I look out here and I look at personal individual liberty, and I say, as a grown person, do you need the president or 50 governors to tell you to protect yourself and to protect your family? We have small unit leaders in the Marine Corps, 19-year-old Lance Corporals who lead 4-man teams that don't need the battalion commander to tell them to put on their mask whenever they go into combat.
Let's hope
and
not. Yeah.
There is a potential hazard. So I look at these folks and I say, who do you actually care about? Is it yourself, or do you care about the whole community and yourself for that matter? Because if you cared about yourself, you wouldn't be so reckless. And I want to say one more thing, Kerby.
Sure, let me put you on hold because I just have one of those mandatory breaks, but I want to hear the rest. And if you can stay with us, we'll come back and start off with Kent right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me get back to Kent in South Carolina. Kent, again, thank you for your service, but you had a couple other things you wanted to share with us, so you have the floor.
Yeah, Kerby, thanks. You've always been very gracious to everybody, and down here in the Low Country, as we call it, I just asked the question, what are people doing to step up? Like our church in Savannah, Georgia, Compassion Christian, is out hanging door hangers with contact information so the elderly and vulnerable who need help with groceries or pharmacy, we can go for them. We got local business owners like veteran Daniel Merritt, who's also running for Congress in Georgia 1. He converted his factory, Non-Line Apparel, to make personal protective equipment for those people like Daniel who are on the front lines, people up in New York. And people can just get involved instead of just protesting. And of course, they can even contact their members of Congress, like here is Joe Cunningham in District 1 of South Carolina, as Democrats continue to block the refunding of the Payment Protection Program. So all these folks who are angry they can't go to work, the whole design the president did, which everybody forgets the fact that 12 years ago, President Obama did nothing when the economy collapsed. This president acted decisively, he acted firmly, he put together a plan, and now Democrats, in order to win political points with their base, are trying to fund it with things that are a bunch of nonsense. In the meantime, people are going without paychecks for no reason because it's already written in the law. The last thing I'll say, though, sir, is the big elephant in the room we don't talk about, and that's the fact that this came out of a biowarfare lab in Wuhan, China, and it's been confirmed that Wuhan manufactures bioweapons there. Whether it was intentionally released or not is irrelevant. They need to be held responsible. The American people need to wake up. This might be the first generation since 9/11, I think, that hasn't had the community get in. It's time for people to get in, stop complaining, and act like real Americans, sir, and that's what I wanted to share.
Kent, I really appreciate you sharing all of that, and after I let you go, I'll talk about a few of those issues. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. He is correct on one issue, and that is another article that I would certainly want to point you to. Andrew Shaisha, I believe is how you pronounce his name, points out that last Thursday the well ran dry on the the Paycheck Protection Program, and at a time when the economy is bleeding 22 million jobs, as he points out here, and you have, in a sense, the lockdown still continuing on. This is a time when you could just have easily added the additional $250 billion to the Paycheck Protection Program. And as the House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy pointed out, that was something that the Secretary of Treasury wanted to do. So that's why the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell went to the floor of the Senate on April 9th to introduce passage for unanimous consent. But instead, now if you want to write to your senators, a couple of them that objected, Maryland Senators Ben Cardin, Chris Van Hollen are a couple. But not only that, in the House, as he was pointing out as well, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and others wanted to add some other things. They didn't just want a clean bill that would provide that kind of funding through the Paycheck Protection Program. They wanted to increase funding to local and state governments and increase funding for federal procurement of supplies. But let me tell you something that the mainstream press didn't tell you. Are you ready? If you go back and look at the CARES Act, they've already provided that funding that the Democrats said they wanted to provide. And guess what? Those hundreds of billions of dollars, they're not flying out the door because, let's use a good example. Let's look at the biggest hotspot right now, New York City. Guess what? They didn't need as many ventilators as they thought they were going to need. A lot of these hospitals have not needed some of the equipment that they thought they were going to need. Yes, there's some shortages. I'm not minimizing that, but that is, I think, an important point. And so there's a good example of, in some respects, playing politics has kept anybody that's a small business owner, and those are pretty much small business owners because it only qualifies for people that have less than 500 employees, not getting that. Also, Christian organizations, churches, other nonprofit organizations, the money ran dry, and so far we don't have any kind of change. So Certainly, that is one point that Kent was making. And back to what you could communicate to your elected officials. We last week had this particular action item at our website, pointofview.net, which simply says that indeed we would like to support this piece of legislation put forward by Senator Tom Cotton, protecting our pharmaceutical supply chain from China. That is on the website so that you can contact your 2 United States senators. And I can pull this out because there's another very good article that just surfaced in which we are now seeing that there is tremendous support for this in the House of Representatives. Let me give credit. Just mentioned Tom Cotton. Let's give credit to Representative Liz Cheney. She's the House Republican Conference Chair, saying that there is bipartisan support for repatriating supply chains in the House, and then goes through talking about this. And let me, for our listeners in Florida, also give a shout out to Representative Michael Waltz, representative from Florida, Republican, who is the main sponsor of the bill called Strengthening America's Supply Chain and National Security Act. By the way, that's not the only bill. I think there's like 3. But nevertheless, the concept is there. And so, Kent, I appreciate those comments as well. Just before I take another phone call, let me also take on one other issue. And that is today we were going to be talking with Michael Perrin about what we can do in our churches to address some of the mental health issues. And we will certainly get back to some of that tomorrow. We have Ben Bennett with us. He works with the Josh McDowell organization and has been working with what we can do to reach out to the millennials and some of that. Tony Evans will be with us tomorrow. I've already taped an interview with Pastor Jack Graham, who's the pastor of Prestonwood Baptist Church. He was actually doing an interview yesterday with the governor of the state of Texas, Greg Abbott. And also the president, Donald Trump, said he was going to watch the service by Jack Graham. Last week, I think he watched the service by Greg Laurie. And so we will certainly play that taped interview that I've already done and get Michael Perrin back on, because it relates to this booklet that we just have coming out shortly on loneliness, because that's another issue. Some of the mental health issues that are starting to surface because of the lockdown are some things that we'll talk about as well. So a lot to cover, but let's, if we can, take some more phone calls. We'll run up to the state of Alaska this time. KJNP, Elmer, thank you for joining our conversation today.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I guess I want to ask about some counterpoint. I hear a lot about liberty and our rights and those things, and I think about the Bible. I think about Paul talking about obeying government leadership and as a Christian obligation. And the other thing, as a theological counterpoint, then he also talks later about if it offends your neighbor to eat meat, then you shouldn't eat meat in front of your neighbor. And similarly, he talks about the things that go on, people eating in the church in Corinth and offending those who don't have the means to eat as well as some of the others who are there. So I guess I just want to offer that as a counterpoint. I'm not saying that I always obey the mask thing and those kinds of things, but I just like you or somebody else mentioned, there's a lot of room for balance here, and I think when we get all politicized, it's to our own cause and our own injury to let that happen.
Well, Elmer, I appreciate you bringing that up. And one of the reasons I posted this piece by Dr. Everett Piper is because he says, indeed, we do have a passage here where the Bible says we're to obey our government, to submit to every ordinance of man, to be subjective to governing authorities. So we can look at Romans 13, we can look at 1 Peter, look at a number of passages. And he says, that's true, but he also then goes on to say, that might be just looking at a truncated view, because he said, for example, if we always obeyed government, then if Moses had, we wouldn't have had the Exodus. If Paul had followed that reasoning, he wouldn't have spent so much time in jail. And he talks about, what about Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, Deborah? He even goes on to then talk about, those people that sometimes were fighting government. That would be Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. So this is an attempt, I think, by Dr. Everett Piper to say, on the one hand, we do obey government. Romans 13, 1 Peter 1, very good passages, and others you could look at that all simply emphasize that. But it also brings us back to my little booklet I'm holding up right now, and that is civil disobedience. Is there ever a time in which government maybe exceeds its authority, in which when we have a direct and specific command which causes us to violate Scripture, then do we have a responsibility to disobey? And I think right now, first of all, we live in a free country, so some people can be out on the streets if they want and protest, whether they want to protest the issues of immigration or gun control, or in this particular case, the lockdown. That's all appropriate. And if nothing else, one of the reasons I posted this piece by Everett Piper is I think it does a good job of trying to help us think through what we do next right here in this pandemic. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me just mention that tomorrow, as I said, we were going to be covering a number of things. When we get into this issue of COVID-19, Ben Bennett will be with us. He works with Josh McDowell's ministry, and they have noticed, for example, that there's just almost astronomical levels of depression and anxiety and a number of other issues with Generation Z compared to even the millennial generation. Now, I might just point out as a program note on Thursday, we will have a millennial roundtable, and Chelsea will be here to run that. But between now and then, we're going to be continuing to talk about what is the role of churches in treating and dealing with mental health and addiction and those kinds of things. So we'll give you a little bit of a preview with that interview. We also, of course, have Dr. Tony Evans will be with us and a variety of other guests. Wednesday, we'll see if we can reschedule the interview we were going to do today with Michael Perrin, and then that's the case. I'll also run the interview that I've already taped with Pastor Jack Graham and focusing again on what the church and what pastors can do to address some of those issues. But just before we wind down, let me talk about a couple of political issues, because this illustrates again what I call the law of unintended consequences. That is, we're starting to see hospitals going into bankruptcy. Just read from our friends here at the Wall Street Journal. Public health officials have directed Americans to stay home to slow the coronavirus spread and ease the burden on healthcare providers. So far, so good. Many areas of the country are succeeding, so much so that hospitals and physicians are hemorrhaging cash due to declining demand for care, because the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention last month recommended that healthcare providers postpone elective procedures to free up capacity and conserve protective equipment for treating coronavirus patients. Governors have likewise ordered providers and citizens to reschedule non-essential appointments, and so we'll see what that is. So hip and knee replacements have been delayed. So have been sometimes mastectomies. Some doctors are pausing chemotherapy treatments for less aggressive cancers due to government recommendations, and also to avoid suppressing patient immune systems, including our engineer today is off, and appreciate Doug sitting in for him as well. So that is something that was sort of an unintended consequence. But if we want to get some of our doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals back to work, we want to keep these hospitals from going into bankruptcy, maybe we need to rethink those particular guidelines and orders as well. And again, it's some of these unintended consequences we talked about even on Friday. You might remember that right now the particular piece of legislation called the CARES Act actually provided people the unemployment benefits that were greater than the salary they received. And that's why a number of senators, led by in particular Senator Ben Sasse, tried to amend the legislation so that it would cap unemployment benefits at 100% of a person's salary before they were laid off, because they were fearful, and the administration was fearful, that the bill would incentivize people to not return to work. If you can make more money by sitting at home watching television than you can by going to the job, guess where you're going to go? Well, that didn't pass, but those are the kinds of issues that certainly need to be addressed and maybe even fixed before we are too much further down the road. But I thought I would end by giving a shout out to Bill Maher. And I didn't think that's going to be happening, but that happens every once in a while. He's an atheist. If most of the time we talk about him, we usually end up talking about things he said that we disagree with, but I've got to agree with him here. This particular article by Jonathan Jones, Bill Maher sends warning to media. Keep up dishonest virus reporting and Trump will win in 2020. The article says HBO host Bill Maher warned the establishment media on his show Friday that their dishonest and sensational reporting during the coronavirus pandemic might actually help President Donald Trump to get reelected. Here's some of the quotes. By the way, I have to edit a few because he uses a lot of words we don't use on this program. He said, now that we're starting to see some hope in all this, Bill Maher said, don't hope shame me. That's a good line. He said the problem with nonstop doom and gloom, he says, is giving Trump the chance to play the optimist. And optimists tend to win American elections. And then if you saw the program, he displayed a graphic from candidate Barack Obama's 2008 campaign. It was a campaign poster that said, remember this? Hope. And again, talking about, and then he also shows some other examples of how they were sensationalizing the pandemic. And then recalling the former president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He says, as full of, and we won't use those words, Donald Trump is, I can see Trump riding into a second term, then there would be no hope left for you to shame. He then went on a little bit later and say, but at some point, the daily drumbeat of depression and terror veers into panic porn, he says. Then he said this idea that everybody claiming life will not be the same, and looked at some of the graphics of coronavirus. And then he says, everything looks scary if you magnify it 1,000 times. And he says, basically, we need the news to calm down and treat us like adults. Trump calls you fake news. Don't make him right. And those were some of the comments by Bill Maher. And I'll pick out one more, because he also then took on the liberals, not just the mainstream media, but he took on the liberals, because Bill Maher was criticizing some of his fellow liberals for being critical of calling the coronavirus as a Chinese virus. And so Bill Maher said, scientists who generally are pretty liberal have been naming diseases after places they came from for a long time. And he says, this has nothing to do with Asian Americans. It has everything to do with China. We can't afford the luxury anymore of non-judginess, I guess that's a word, towards a country that habits that kill millions of people everywhere. Because it isn't the first time, Bill Maher says. SARS came from China, and the bird flu, and the Hong Kong flu, and the Asian flu. And then he concluded that he was concerned that there are people out there who would rather die from the virus than call it by the wrong name. So anyway, some great material there, but it again is an illustration of some of these issues that are front and center. And so this week we'll probably move away from this idea of giving you an opportunity to take action. So if you have not taken an action, go to the website, pointofview.net, that middle section there, take action, protecting our pharmaceutical supply chain. And we've made it very easy for you to contact your 2 United States senators. And, of course, if you want to contact your member of Congress, it looks like this is going to pass, we hope, both the Senate and the House, but they need to hear from you. So that is up today, but pretty soon we're going to move from that one to give you a chance to maybe contact your governor. Since we broadcast in, 42 different states, we have a system that will, once you put in your state, allow you then to have the link to your governor, and you can encourage him or her to move ahead or slow up or whatever, because that's a real important issue as well. And, of course, if you want to contact your members of Congress and encourage them to refill the Paycheck Protection Program, as we talked about just a little bit ago with, was it Kent, I think was talking about that, then those are some very important issues to address as well. If you would like more information on some of the things we've talked about, including many of the articles we've posted, first one on governors say it is too soon to open up America. Second one, which is a piece which I call about the loss of liberty, because that's a piece by Everett Piper, who wants to help us sort of navigate between safety and liberty, between obeying government and still expressing our concerns. So I thought you might want to read that piece. One about the vaccine not being developed, and, of course, we have information about the interview that we did earlier on The Mirror or the Mask by Lydia McGrew. From time to time, I like to take our minds off of the pandemic for just a little bit, so that's what we did today, and we will certainly have lots to talk about tomorrow. I want to thank Doug for sitting in today and doing the engineering, and, of course, Steve for taking those phone calls and producing the program. I hope you've appreciated everything we've talked about here on the program. So we will see you back here tomorrow on Tuesday, right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.